Faith belongs in medicine. I know this statement is very bold, and some of my colleagues and maybe some of you may be a little uncomfortable with this statement. Because when we think about medicine, we often think about science and data, medications, procedures, labs, imaging. But faith, spirituality, prayer, those conversations have often been pushed to the side by traditional healthcare. And I believe it shouldn't. Here's why. There's several studies that have explored the connection between spirituality and lower rates of depression, better coping mechanisms, increased resilience, lower stress, and even longevity. And research have looked into the effects of prayer and meditation on blood pressure and the nervous system. And there are entire fields of study that are now dedicated to meaning and purpose and health outcomes. And some of the longest living populations in the world share practices that are centered around faith and purpose and community. So this creates an interesting tension. If medicine is ultimately about healing, why is faith often uncomfortable to talk about in these settings? Why do so many patients rely on faith during the hardest times of their lives, and yet many clinicians hesitate to bring it up? And what does the science say about all of this? That is what today's episode is about. Today, I'm going to explore with you the intersection between faith and health, and not just from a sensationalized perspective, definitely not anti-science, but from a thoughtful and evidence-based one. All about the science. Today, I'm going to talk about what the research has found about stress, faith, meaning, resilience, community, and longevity. I'm going to explore with you why faith practices may affect your body more than you realize. And we're going to create some space for the nuance. We have to talk about it as well. But by the end of this episode, my hope is that you're going to walk away thinking more deeply about your healing as something that involves your mind, body, purpose, and yes, faith. Welcome to Fuller Living, your space for empowerment, inspiration, and practical health nuggets. Here you'll find relatable guidance that fits your everyday life as you journey to a fuller and healthier you. I'm your host, Dr. Ashitey. Let's dig in. Welcome back to Fuller Living, wherever you are listening from, whether you've been carrying something heavy lately or trying to hold it all together. Maybe you've simply been thinking about what healing actually means. Wherever you are in life today, as always, I am so glad that you're here with me. This episode has been sitting on my mind for quite a while because as a doctor, I've noticed something interesting over the years. Some of the most meaningful conversations that my patients and I have aren't always about medications or lab results. And I know some of my patients who are watching know this to be true. Sometimes these conversations are about fear, about hope, purpose, and yes, even prayer. Sometimes our conversations are about whether someone still has the strength to keep going. These conversations are often during moments when patients feel the most vulnerable. For instance, after a huge diagnosis, or during grief, while waiting for answers, or while trying to make sense of suffering. In these moments, people rarely think about scientific stuff alone. They ask human questions, questions about meaning, questions about hope, questions about whether they're even alone. Thankfully, over time, even medicine has started to recognize this gap. For years, healthcare had largely operated through what's called the biomedical model, which was identify disease, diagnose the problem, treat the body, and that's it. And that model has given us incredible advances in science, don't get me wrong. Yet many clinicians and researchers started to notice something important. Two patients can have the same disease, could experience the same illness, but have the experience different. Their stress matters, their support system matters, their mental health matters, their sense of meaning, and even their beliefs matter. So in other words, healing is complicated and more human than biology alone. So this realization has helped shape how we approach things, more from now a biopsychosocial spiritual model, and one that recognizes that health is not just physical, but it's also emotional, relational, psychological, and for many, spiritual. And I think this really matters because many patients are already bringing faith into moments of illness, whether medicine acknowledges it or not. So today, I want us to explore that tension together thoughtfully. What role does faith actually play in healing? And what does research show us? And how does that apply to you and I? Because remember, application matters more than everything. Let's get into it. Let's start at the beginning. One of the first ways that faith may intersect with health, the nervous system. This is one of the clearest areas where researchers have found a measurable effect. Stress, regulation, and how your body responds to stillness and faith. This is important because stress is not just this thing that we feel. In fact, we've talked about this so many times on this podcast. Chronic stress can affect your entire body. It affects your heart rate, your blood pressure, sleep, hormones, inflammation, your immune function. And over time, your body starts to carry this stress physically. This is very well studied. In fact, one of the most well-known researchers in this area was a Harvard cardiologist named Herbert Benson. Back in the 70s, Benson began studying people who regularly practiced meditation and repetitive prayer. And what he found was quite fascinating, that during these practices, the body often entered a state that appeared to be the opposite of the stress response. The heart rate lowered, blood pressure decreased, your oxygen consumption dropped. And he eventually named this response the relaxation response. Now, this doesn't mean that faith can simply be reduced to biology either, but I do think it raises an important point. Spirituality may affect the body more deeply than we once realized. Honestly, as a physician, I have seen this. I've seen patients whose bodies have been carrying stress for years, exhausted, unable to rest, people whose minds never really slow down, even for a second. And then one of the first things they described to me after reconnecting with prayer and faith is peace. Not that their problems suddenly disappeared, but that something in their body finally stopped bracing for the worst. And I think this really matters because healing is not about treating disease alone. It's also about what happens inside a person when fear decreases, when hope returns, when the nervous system softens, and when someone no longer feels alone or that they have to carry everything alone. And perhaps that's what science is slowly starting to uncover. That as human beings, we're not simply biological systems that people manage. We're emotional, we're relational, and yes, we are spiritual. The second way that faith may intersect with health is through meaning. The practice of medicine teaches us that people are often not affected by suffering equally. You can have two people who experience the same thing or similar diagnoses, similar hardships, similar losses, and yet they respond differently. And this difference is not something that we can always explain by our labs, our imaging, or physiology alone. And that brings me to the story of Viktor Frankl. Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist who had been imprisoned during Nazi Germany time in the concentration camps. He'd lost his parents, his brother, his wife. He'd lost everything. While he was enduring starvation himself and all the brutality that we've come to learn about, he began observing something that would stay with him long after the war ended. He noticed that when people completely lost their sense of meaning or hope, many seemed to decline rapidly. Now, others, on the other hand, despite that same horrific conditions, somehow continued to endure. Sometimes it's because they longed to see a loved one again, and so they had hope. Sometimes it was their faith or purpose, or it was this belief that this suffering, though we hate to think of it that way, maybe had some meaning for them. Those observations eventually shaped his work, which was centered around resilience and meaning. One of his most well-known ideas is that people can endure incredible hardship when they still have a reason to keep going. And while most of us, thankfully, will never experience hardship to that scale, I do think many of us understand what it feels like to become disconnected from meaning, to wake up exhausted, numb, not even know why you're doing what you're doing. Interestingly, modern research supports this very idea that meaning matters deeply for health and well being. There are studies that have linked this greater sense of meaning and purpose with lower rates of depression, greater resilience, better coping during illness, and overall, an improved psychological well being. Here's a fact: human beings do not experience life as machines. We interpret our experiences, we search for meaning and suffering, we search for hope during times of uncertainty. I remember one Bible scripture, of course, about Joseph when he had been put in this very bad place, and his brothers, who were the ones who put him in the suffering, came. And later on, he was in a better position where things made sense for everyone. And he said, "You know what? God did this so that something good could turn out of it." Now, I understand a lot of people may not believe that, but it's okay. The point that I'm trying to make is that there's something about hope and faith that helps people keep going on. And I think this is another place where medicine is continuing to grow, recognizing that healing is not always about removing pain. Sometimes it's about helping people sustain hope while moving through pain. The third way faith intersects with health is through community and connection. I think this is one that is especially important because in our modern life, we've become incredibly disconnected. We're more digitally connected than ever before, and yet many of us are deeply lonely. People are carrying their stress privately, we're struggling privately, we're grieving privately. And one of the things researchers have consistently found over the years is that isolation affects our health more than we thought. In fact, some researchers now express or describe loneliness as a major public health concern because it's associated with, again, depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, decline in our cognition, and even earlier mortality. We do better when we're connected. And this is another area where faith communities become interesting from a health perspective. Because for many people, faith is not experienced alone. It's experienced in community through shared belief, shared support, shared grief, and shared hope. We see the impact of this most clearly during difficult seasons in life. We see it when someone's sick and suddenly meals begin to arrive at their home. People check in, people pray for them. They drive them to appointments, sit with them in the hospital. And while medicine can prescribe treatments, community often helps carry people through emotionally hard times. Researchers studying religion and health, including work at Duke, show that there is an association between religious involvement and things like lower substance use, greater resilience, stronger social support, and improved coping during illness overall. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that religion magically prevents suffering, but faith communities still experience grief. They experience illness, loss, hardship. We know this. But the connection changes how people move through this suffering. People often heal differently when they feel supported, when they feel seen, when they feel like they're not alone. And beyond doctrine or ritual, faith often gives people something many modern lives are missing: belonging, a place to gather, a reason to connect, a reminder that they matter to other people, they matter to God. All right, now before I close this episode, I think it's very important to talk about something important. Important to talk about something important. Whenever we talk about faith and health, people can sometimes move towards extremes very quickly. On one side, there's this idea that faith has no place in medicine at all. And on the other hand, there are others who believe that somehow faith should replace medicine entirely. Neither of those positions serve people at all. This episode is not about suggesting that prayer replaces treatment, and it's not about blaming people for their illness. And it's definitely not about implying that someone lacks faith because they're struggling physically, emotionally, or mentally. Not at all. Illness is part of our human experience. Faithful people get sick. They experience grief. They experience depression, trauma, suffering like everyone else. And medicine also matters deeply. It matters, and therapy matters, surgery matters, evidence-based care matters. They all matter. But I also believe medicine becomes stronger, not weaker, when it recognizes the full complexity of human beings. We're not simply bodies. We're emotional beings. We're relational beings. We're meaning-seeking beings. We're spiritual beings. So this means this conversation about healing cannot always remain limited only to lab values or symptoms. Sometimes it has to involve hope. It has to involve peace. It has to involve purpose, support, and meaning, and the ability to endure difficult seasons without losing oneself completely. Faith is that thing that helps people navigate the realities of being human more resiliently. Now to the most important part of the episode. If faith and meaning and connection affect how we experience stress and suffering and healing, then maybe health is not just about what we eat or the exercise we do or the medications we take. Maybe part of health is also about keeping us grounded during difficult seasons of life. What reminds us that we're not alone, what helps us sustain hope, and reconnects us to meaning, peace, and community. And I think this matters because so many of us are trying to navigate life completely isolated. We're carrying our stress privately. We're struggling alone. We're grieving alone. And even though human beings were never designed to do life alone. So here's what this week's SMART goal is all about. Remember, a SMART goal is one that is specific, it's measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. This week, I want you to intentionally reconnect with one practice, person, or community that helps ground you spiritually, emotionally, and relationally. Maybe it's reattending a place of worship. Maybe you're going to call someone you trust. Maybe you're joining a small group. Maybe you're praying with someone. Whatever it is, go ahead and put it down as something you're going to do this week. It's going to be specific. Choose one intentional action. Measurable, do it at least once this week. Achievable, keep it realistic and simple. Relevant, this is because connection and meaning support your health more than many people realize. But today we've made the point, so now you know. And time bound, let's do this within 7 days. As you do it, I want you to pay attention not only to what you think, but how you feel. How does stress feel for you? Do you feel a sense of peace? Do you feel more connected? Because sometimes healing begins in that moment when you stop carrying everything by yourself. Today, we explored a topic that medicine has not always known how to talk about freely: faith. And what I hope this episode showed you is that there is a connection that's much more nuanced than people actually assume. Faith and spirituality are not only abstract ideas for many people, they influence how we cope with stress, how we endure with suffering, how we find meaning, how we experience community and support in our life. And increasingly, research is starting to support that. We talked about how faith practices may help regulate your nervous system. We talked about how meaning can shape resilience even during difficult times in your life. And we talked about how faith communities can provide connection and support during some of the hardest times in our lives. Faith doesn't always remove the hard times, but we often move through them differently when we have hope, when we have meaning, peace, and community. That's part of what this conversation ultimately comes down to: recognizing that healing is deeply human and humans are more than just biology alone. I know throughout this whole podcast, 72 episodes deep, I've been talking a lot about biology and physiology, but I hope this adds more to your experience. I want to hear from you. How is your faith? How is meaning, connecting with your healing journey? Let me know in the comments. And if this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, you need to subscribe to this channel and leave me your raving review. It genuinely helps me get more people get in on these conversations that are going to make people live healthier and fuller lives. I can't wait to see you next week for another riveting episode. Until then, let's get to fuller living. Well, fam, that wraps up another episode of Fuller Living, where we talk about health in a bite-sized, relatable, practical, and fun way. Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about making progress one small step at a time while remaining consistent. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, share it with a friend who might need a little bit of inspiration, and leave me your 5-star review. And if you're in Dallas and looking for a new PCP, look me up at southwestfamilymed.com. I can't wait to meet you. Until next time, let's get to fuller living.